All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming again. Sorry, the teacher part of me is habituated to starting things right on time. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, but there's always a little bit of orientation at the beginning. So anyone who wanders in late, I hope, will be able to jump in. So just as a reminder, we're in the third of our first series within a larger series, I hope, of examining different religious traditions from around the world. The first week was kind of an orientation to the topic as a whole. Last week we talked about Hinduism, and this week we're going to talk about Buddhism. But as always, the goals are, first of all, to examine some key teaching, story, ritual, or practice that's connected with a particular religious tradition, Hinduism today, and then to consider how each of these traditions might challenge or enlighten Episcopalian Christians who are seeking to love God and our neighbor. So I'll give you a quick preview of the three things that I have discovered in Hinduism that I find the most challenging as well as illuminating for my own faith. The first is the doctrine of no self, and I'll be talking more about these toward the end. One is another doctrine, but of skillful means. And the last one is freedom from views. All right, so there are lots of terms with abstract meaning, but I'll give you some examples once we get to them. But I'll probably spend most of the time giving a broader overview of Buddhism as a whole. So I want to start with a reminder of something I did last time, which was to distinguish two types, broadly, of religious traditions. One model we call a tree model, because it's inspired particularly by a historical event, but usually the teachings of an individual person who might grow out of another tradition, but usually we trace it to something about this, some insight, some events related to this person, and then the religious tradition branches out from there. Last week, though, we focused on Hinduism, and in this typology, it's more of a river model of religious tradition. That is, it has lots of different streams and inputs, different practices associated with a particular region of the world. That would be around the Indus Valley, the Indian subcontinent, that eventually kind of were integrated and flowed together into a coherent tradition that we call Hinduism today. But we're going with the tree model. So last time it was a river model. This time we have Buddhism. It follows more a tree model. But there are going to be some continuities with Hinduism, so your time was not wasted last week, all right? We still have the problem of samsara, that is the cycle of rebirth and re-death, all right? So Buddhism also offers solutions to that same problem, the need to escape the cycle of reincarnation. The cycle of rebirth is also understood to be fueled by karma and its consequences, right? So if I do bad things in my life, I generate negative karma that I need to work out in future incarnations. I might also generate positive karma, right, by the good things that I do. And that also generates consequences in this world. I have to be reborn to enjoy all the rewards for the good things I did in that life. So this cycle of rebirth and re-death is fueled by karma and the consequences of that karma. And by the way, I said do, but it includes things that we say, that we think, that we feel. These all generate karmic consequences. And again, like in Hinduism, we can recognize kind of two tracks of practice in this religious tradition. One, we have folks who are aiming for the ultimate goal in this lifetime of escaping samsara. So there's a strong monastic tradition within Buddhism. Depending on the tradition, sometimes those folks are understanding to be really going for it. In fact, I was told once by a Buddhist nun, so this may or may not be representative, that if you're married, you are practicing, you have formed an attachment in this life that inhibits your ability to escape from this cycle and to be liberated. So if you're a married person or someone who's romantically or deeply attached to another person, this probably isn't the lifetime that you are going to escape. So some Buddhists think you have to be a monk or a nun. I see married couples looking at each other, I guess we'll try next time. I don't know. And so not all Buddhists believe that, but it's a possibility. And then we have kind of the easier track, which is people who are seeking a better rebirth through karmic merit. So I could devote this life to doing, thinking, feeling good things so that in my next life, I might have a more favorable opportunity to really go for escape. All right, so those are some of the continuities with Hinduism, which we talked about last week. But as I said, the Buddhism follows the tree model of religion, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the life of the Buddha himself. So his name was Gautama, as far as we can know, and he was born in the 6th century BCE. I mentioned last time that a lot of scholars theorize this sort of what we call the axial age, where there was some kind of something in the air, all right, where we get lots of new kind of insights and interests among human beings in religion. So the Buddha is part of this kind of vibe of the time. So he's the son of a local ruler in an area of modern-day India and Nepal. So he's a real person born about this time. So I've been to the Buddha's birthplace. It's called Lumbini, and here I've just shared some photographs of, these aren't ones that I took, but lots of different nations have their own temples constructed at that site. So until I went there, I didn't really appreciate some of the subtle differences between Thai and Japanese and all different traditions of architecture. I still don't show me flashcards or anything. But walking around there, you really see, this is a culturally diverse tradition that has lots of different ways of building sacred space at the Buddha's birthplace in Lumbini. So a couple episodes from the life of the Buddha, he, according to tradition, had a very sheltered youth. Some people say his father had heard a prophecy about him and that he would either be a renouncer or a ruler, and he wanted his son to go into the family business, right? So he kind of protected him from understanding some of the suffering and challenges of life in this world because he didn't want to tempt his son to become a spiritual seeker. So he had every comfort, delight he could. He got married. He had a son. And then he got someone to take him outside of the palace, and he saw what are known as the 4 sights. So he saw an old person, a sick person, a dead body, and a wandering ascetic. So what last week I would have called a renouncer. So a Hindu renouncer, someone who deprives themselves of sometimes bathing, changes of clothes, food, family life, career, all those kind of things. So that was kind of the first solution he saw to those problems. So in this tradition, he realized from these 4 sights, the sick man, the old person, the sick person, and the corpse, represented here as a skeleton, he realized that there was suffering and death in the world, which he did not know there was before. And then he sees the renouncer. Some people think that's the Buddha sitting there in the saffron robe. It's not. The Buddha is the one in the cart. He is like fancily dressed. But he sees this religious person and thinks, I should probably do that too. Now that I know that there's change and age and suffering and death and illness in the world, I'm going to become a spiritual guy. So he begins to practice extreme asceticism, that is kind of depriving himself, especially of food. But then he, again, according to this tradition, he overhears a musician saying that if a string of their instrument is too loose, it won't really play. It won't, be resonant. If it's too tight, though, it will break. And so the Buddha saw himself as, or Gautama at the time, saw himself as that tight string, and thinks there needs to be a middle way between the indulgent life of my youth and the extreme asceticism now. And you can read these texts where he talks about, about his suffering, that he can see his bones, all this extreme thing. And so a woman offers him milk rice, a bite of milk rice. So this is, you can still taste versions of this dish. It's delicious. And he accepts her offering. So milk rice is like, rich, desserty rice, So he accepts this offering and discovers the middle way between indulgence on the one hand and asceticism as the other. You can see Episcopalians love this, right? We really like the middle way, okay? Then he meditates under a tree for, I think, 49 days, all right? and he achieves nirvana or enlightenment. So I'm going to pause here to talk about that word, nirvana. You see lots of different translations. It's not just a band, all right? So people use it to mean enlightenment or awakening. So the awakening metaphor is pretty popular. It's like all of us right now are walking around kind of asleep or in a dream. One day we might be awakened, all right? Realize the illusions that we're living under. That's a good metaphor for this. More specifically, it's liberation. I like the liberation translation, like moksha from last time, from dukkha, which means suffering. I always remember dukkha means suffering because I mostly taught high school in Nepal, but I had one group of second graders, and it's the same root to mean something hurts, dukkha, and tauko means head. So several of them would say, "Ma'am, my tauko is duking." Duking would mean hurt, so they kind of took their root word and put English endings on it. So I'll never forget what dukkha means, suffering. And samsara, which we've already talked about already. So it's liberation. So basically, you're not, once you've reached enlightenment, you're not going to have another rebirth. More literally, though, and I actually prefer this, even though you hear awakening and enlightenment a lot, I prefer the more literal translation. It just helps me think more concretely of extinction. So nirvana means extinction or putting out. And it's kind of like you've put out the fires that cause the cycle of rebirth. So I like this image of cutting off the fuel source, basically. Now, the Buddha and people who achieve enlightenment don't die immediately. So they aren't completely snuffed out. And so some people call this nirvana with remainder. And the remainder is, you still have a body, like a human life that is going to live X number of years after your enlightenment. But if you've achieved enlightenment, you've cut off the fuel source, right? And then the candle of your bodily life slowly burns out, and then you're not reborn again. So that's what the Buddha achieved after meditating for 49 days. So after that, he became a preacher and went to some of his companions who were ascetics with him when he was in that extreme ascetic stage of his life, and he gathered what's called the sangha, or the community. So even today, a sangha, I should say even in English, people often refer to a Buddhist community as a sangha. If you go meditate with a community, they might call that your sangha. Sangha just means with, at least in Nepali. So what did he preach? So the basic content of his preaching is known as the Four Noble Truths. The first one is that suffering is a fact of life, right? The existence, you see different phrasing, but there is suffering, okay? And then a lot of these have single names, but arising, here it just means suffering has a cause, especially craving and ignorance are causes of suffering. There are others too. I'll talk about this in a second. Then cessation. Since suffering has a cause, that cause can be eliminated, and there's a path to the elimination of suffering. So then you get the Noble Eightfold Path, but I don't want to just do like lists of things. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about this concept of suffering in Buddhism, because it's pretty distinct as well as elaborated over time. So what exactly it means to say that suffering is a fact of life. So I'm going to go through some of the sources of suffering in Buddhist teaching. The first one is obvious, right? If you ever had an injury, if you've ever been sick, pain, obviously, suffering. I'll say right now I'm not suffering though, but from a Buddhist perspective, I might still be suffering in other ways. So change is also a source of suffering, right? And, many of us know this intuitively, right? You're not as strong as you used to be. Things change. Someone you loved moves away, right? These are also pretty intuitive for non-Buddhists as sources of suffering. Then we have a teaching about what are sometimes called the three poisons, all right? And I had actually the Buddhist nun who told me the thing about marriage being incompatible with seeking liberation. This is before I was married, by the way, so it doesn't come off so negative. But I remember, she used to lead some meditations in Kathmandu at a meditation center, so I went to them. But she would always say the three poisons. She said greed, hatred, and aversion. There's different translations. But the first would be attachment or greed, all right? So your friend, like many of us think of our friendships or family bonds, whatever they are, as kind of something that relieves our suffering. From a Buddhist perspective, that might actually be something that causes your suffering. It might be a source of suffering in your life. Aversion and hatred, right? Negative reactions, strongly negative reactions thing is like a poison or adds fuel to the fire of suffering. And lastly, ignorance and delusion, right? We delude ourselves into, believing certain things. So I have a picture, actually, here we go, of the Wheel of Rebirth. There's lots of paintings along like this, but the kind of main, the wedges, I guess you could say, signify different realms or forms in which you could be reborn. The top one is you could be reborn as a god, right? A god within the context of Buddhism is different than a Christian concept of God. It's like a really great life, but it's also finite, right? It doesn't last forever. So gods are not immortals necessarily. So you could be reborn as a god, you could be reborn as an animal, as a hungry ghost. In Buddhist cosmology, each of these wedges represents the type of rebirth you might have. But in the middle are symbols of greed, hatred, and delusion. So it's a great visual representation of these are the three poisons that keep this wheel turning. And I think a rooster is representative of lust or greed, avarice. And I think a snake is often hatred. You see different things. And then a pig, although I've seen people say the pig is greed, but it could also be ignorance. But you get the idea that there's a core that keeps the wheel turning. All right. So there's another source of suffering, which I won't fully get into, but I include it just to say that this is a worked out doctrine, right? Sometimes if I just say, the Buddhists teach that life is suffering, they really investigate closely the nature of reality and why that causes suffering. So another cause is the conditioned nature of existence. Some people call this dependent arising, but a kind of maybe too simple way of explaining it is that I like to think, let's say, that when I took my 5-minute drive to church this morning, I got here safe and sound. I'm here because I'm an excellent and safe driver, right? But really, you could also say, I got here because an intoxicated driver didn't cut out in front of me and crash into my car. And so we like to think we're in greater control of our lives and have greater independence than we really do, but the reality we live in from this perspective is that I'm the result of decisions my parents made and my parents' parents made and, acts of chance, acts of choice, all these kinds of things. And I've heard a different explanation that either that fact causes suffering, right, that I'm not in full control of my life, or ignorance of that fact is what causes suffering, right? Like by ignoring the ways that we're all interdependent, interconnected, the ways that we are the results of many factors, our ignorance of that is what causes our suffering. Yeah. All right, so that's suffering. So then the Buddha, this is one of the nice things about the Buddha is he lived a nice long life. He made it to 80, right? It would be great to make it well beyond 80, But he's not someone who died a martyr and young, So the Buddha's death is referred to as parinirvana, meaning nirvana without remainder, kind of ultimate nirvana. So he achieved nirvana, I don't know, in his 30s or something like that, and then went on, it's like I said, cut off the fuel source, but still had, 50 good years of life in his body, right? And so he's still in samsara, in this world, in this cycle of birth and rebirth, technically, physically. But then when he dies, he's not coming back. All right, so they call it his parinirvana. Yeah. So that's some basics about the Buddha, the kind of origin of that tree, but then we get lots of branches, or you could say layers as well. The image I have here is of the Buddha, probably closely related to the earlier but still existent tradition of Theravada Buddhism, and the Buddha on the other side is actually not the same Buddha. All right, this is the Buddha Maitreya, and in some Buddhist views, once the world completely forgets the teachings of the Buddha, there's no Buddhism, I'm not giving talks like this, everybody completely forgets these insights into suffering, the sources of suffering, the way to cease suffering, then another Buddha will come and restore all of those teachings. Okay, so this Maitreya Buddha, the laughing Buddha, is that guy, all right? Right now, he's in some heavenly, awesome place, right? Waiting until the whole world, and it's going to take, measures of time that the human mind cannot comprehend. We'll all forget the teachings of the Buddha, and then Buddha Maitreya, as opposed to Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, will teach Buddhism all over again. Will discover the teachings himself in his human form and then disseminate them to others. So the cosmology gets more complicated over time, as we'll see. So I'm going to introduce kind of 4 main types of Buddhism. Mainstream Buddhism is sometimes called Theravada Buddhism, or the way of the elders, because it understands itself to be older. It's one of these funny things, like all types of Christians, like we all say, well, we're the ones doing it the way the apostles did. All these other people corrupt. It's kind of similar. So they all have stories about how they go back to the original Buddha. But this is probably the oldest version. More common in Thailand, Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, Cambodia, and Sri Lanka. But it's only about 13% of Buddhists today who practice Theravada Buddhism. Characteristics are the ideal is an arhat. So the word Siddhartha, some of you may know that word, as a name for the Buddha, meaning perfect and one who has achieved enlightenment. So it wasn't a name given. It would be a very presumptuous name, I guess, to have given. I do know people named Siddhartha now, but after the Buddha. So the ideal is to become an arhat, one who's attained enlightenment. And enlightenment has to be achieved by your own efforts. No one can do this for you, right? You're the one who has to come to these insights through meditation. You can have teachers, right? But no one can do it for you, okay? Another tradition of Buddhism, which developed a little bit later, is Mahayana Buddhism. Maha means great. Yana would be vehicle or cart. And it's more common in Korea, China, Japan, Nepal, and Tibet. And it's a wider range of Buddhists. That's the majority today. So the critical difference here is there's a value of compassion over self-effort. All right, so in this view, you don't have to go to enlightenment all the way on your own. Other beings, I should say, can assist you. So this is just an image of, I think this is what's called a bodhisattva, Avalokiteshvara. See all those arms? Like, it's just wonderful. Signifying all the help that can be offered to you through him. Here, the ideal is not to become an arhat, a person enlightened through their own efforts, but someone who could become an arhat, but who says, I could leave samsara, leave this cycle, but I'm not going to. I'm going to stay in samsara in order to help other beings achieve enlightenment. Okay, so compassion becomes the greater value in this tradition than enlightenment. Okay, so while they're in samsara, they can gain additional karmic merit through practicing the 6 perfections. I didn't include all 6, but generosity, meditation, patience, etc. And then they transfer that merit to other beings. Okay, so if I were a bodhisattva, I'm not, but if I were, right, I could say, I could just ditch you all and say, save yourselves, right? Or I could say, I'm going to stay in this realm and meditate and practice generosity and patience, and then transfer all of that to other beings. And I did once, you don't have to be a bodhisattva, by the way, in some traditions to transfer your merit. I did participate in it was like the closing of a longer meditation retreat where we did this as a form of meditation, the transfer of whatever merit we had generated through meditating on this retreat. It's kind of a separate type of meditation, but you kind of envision yourself radiating that out, right, to whoever needs it. So the bodhisattvas, in some ways, they look to people, especially who are not Buddhists, they look a lot like gods, right? But they're beings to whom people show devotion in ways that resemble ways that we express devotion to God. So here's just famous one. Here's another image of Avalokiteshvara with all of his many arms. And then there is, this is like an art history mystery, how representations of Avalokiteshvara over time, and Kuan Yin, there's different spellings of this depending on the translation, but or the transliteration, but comes to be represented as female, as Guan Yin. So if you're a loose leaf tea drinker like I am, you might see tea Kuan Yin or Kuan as a way of branding tea, right? Well, that's named after this bodhisattva, who now is represented as feminine. Mahayana, as I mentioned, uses this, or translates to mean great vehicle, and this tradition of Buddhism is thought to be greater because it can transport more people to nirvana more quickly, right, through borrowing the merit of bodhisattvas. And this is the good news, you don't have to be like the monastic traditions. You can achieve nirvana without renouncing marriage or children or jobs, right, if you express devotion to a bodhisattva. And you can rely on help from others. You don't have to do this all through your own efforts. I forgot, three more traditions that are all really subsets of Mahayana. Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana, means the thunderbolt vehicle, which combines Mahayana Buddhism with Tibetan traditions, especially of mantras, visualization, chanting. A lama is a teacher of Dharma, so I put the Dalai Lama here, which just means ocean teacher. It's not his name. I put one of these pictures up before, but Tibetan Buddhism is one form of Buddhism I became more familiar with because there are lots of Tibetans in exile living in Nepal, at least at this time. So these are pictures that I took. I'm in one of them. It's a Buddhist Swayambhunath stupa. And these prayer flags, which I really enjoy, they have prayers written on them that people string up, and I've heard different explanations, but the wind blows them and they are lifted up to the bodhisattvas or the gods even, although not understood to be immortal. And I did a couple retreats, not meditation retreats in this case, but stays at Koppen Monastery, which is a monastery built by Tibetan monks in exile. And there's a lot of chanting in these traditions, as well as prostrations. And one morning I was up just listening to the chanting. There's a little area where you could sit. I didn't really know what was going on, but it's early in the morning, and they come around and bring tea to all the monks. And the tea looked like milky, like you'd expect a chai to be. And I thought, oh, this is going to taste great. And I tasted it, and it was yak butter tea, which is salty, right? So it's supposed to sustain you. And so that's my one, exposure to this. But anyway, it's supposed to sustain you through your chanting and things. But it made it very memorable. All right. But people would come to the monastery to participate in rituals, things like that. So another tradition is Pure Land Buddhism, which is associated with medieval Japan. And in this tradition, you have a goal of entering a cosmic Buddha's pure land. All right, so the goal becomes not quite directly to achieve nirvana, but just to be reborn either as a permanent stopping place or as a place where you're absolutely certain to have that be your last lifetime. You try to be reborn there. And you can be reborn there in very simple ways, like by chanting the Amitabha Buddha's name close to your death, all right, and just relying on the infinite compassion of this Buddha. So that's like a shortcut you can take. Try to be reborn in the Amitabha Buddha's pure land. Then we have Chan Buddhism or Zen Buddhism, which is probably the type of Buddhism that's most familiar. In some ways, it looks like a return to Theravada Buddhism. But here the emphasis is largely on personal effort, not on help from Buddhas or bodhisattvas. The emphasis is on direct experience, not on revelatory scriptures, that is sort of reading scripture and interpreting it. And it's practical, more practical than philosophical. And it's really popular in the West. Okay, so I'm going to say a little bit more about that. A lot of us have conceptions of Buddhism, for one, that Buddhism equals meditation, right? But most Buddhists do not actually meditate, right? Even monks and nuns often engage primarily in chanting or maybe visualization. Now, many Buddhists do, but it's not like the normal way, or I should say, it's not the typical way to be Buddhist, all right? Also, here in the United States, I can say, and I'm from Southern California, so Buddhism was always presented to me as like the good religion. You know, you take all the stuff that we don't like about American, Western, European Christianity, right, and get rid of it, and then you're left with Buddhism, right? But I will say that in the world, right, you know, people give their classic examples of Buddhist monks even engaging in violence and things. But my personal example of this experience is, I don't know if anyone's heard of the country Bhutan, all right? So it's a Buddhist kingdom, you know, very protective of its culture. There's just a beautiful, famous image of one of their monasteries. And it pops up in the news every so often. So in Bhutan, you know, we have gross domestic product. Apparently in Bhutan, they have gross domestic happiness, right, where they survey people and count that as a measure of development. So, you know, it's really great. It's important. And so you often see news like this, you know, is Bhutan a paradise? You know, we need to be more like the country of Bhutan. Well, in Nepal, I will say, this is just an actual news story about a Nepali family being kicked out of Bhutan. And here's just an image of that. There are big refugee camps in Nepal because people who were ethnically Nepali a few generations ago moved to Bhutan to take service jobs. And eventually their population got really large to a point that it was perceived as a threat to Bhutanese culture, and they kicked them out. So you have, again, more generations living in Nepalese refugee camps because they are ethnic Nepali, but their citizenship is Bhutanese. So I bring this up not to like air the dirty laundry of other religious traditions, but just to say that, you know, many countries around the world create refugee crises through their border policies, even Buddhist ones, right? So I always try to say, you know, some of us have like an extremely rosy picture of Buddha, like, oh, if we could just be like those Buddhists, we wouldn't have all these problems. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. I also happened to attend a conference panel a couple years ago on sexual abuse scandals within Buddhist communities, right? And so one of the takeaways there was people are very familiar with Christian institutions that cover up abuse, right, and protect abusers. And they say, but on the other hand, large institutions in Christianity often have the ability to require training, conduct background checks, you know, do all this kind of stuff that protects against abuse. But the way Buddhism is practiced in the United States, it's often centered on a charismatic person who has a lot of potential to abuse, right? There are many Buddhists, of course, who are not in abusive relationships with their people, but it's kind of something that we should know affecting lots of different religious traditions. I often have heard, oh, you know, Christianity, it's so institutionalized. If only we can be like Buddhists, you know. But actually, outside the United States, Buddhism is very institutionalized, you know. And within the United States, lack of institution is not necessarily protective against forms of abuse. All right. Okay, so now I'm going to get to those three things that I find challenging but also illuminating to me as an Episcopal Christian. So one of them comes from, it's one of the three marks of existence. I've already talked about dukkha, suffering, impermanence. All right, many of us, like I said, know this intuitively. But this one I find the most interesting. It's the doctrine of no self. Now, I put the word here, I think this is a Pali word, so that you could see, you might recognize this word Atman as the end of this word. We saw that word last time in Hinduism to refer to the stable, eternal soul that gets reincarnated successively over multiple incarnations. But the an in front of it is a negating prefix. So it's saying, so those Hindus, right, they have an Atman, right, and they're saying us Buddhists, right, are an-Atman, right? We deny the existence of that eternal, stable soul. Okay. So I want you to know that root of it, because sometimes there's misconceptions. No self, it means like, I don't exist, all right? So it's a very specific, it means you don't have an Atman, all right? So I like this quote, the Buddhist denial of self is not an absolute denial of self, of any form of self, but it's a specific denial of the self as an enduring substance. Okay, so they're denying something very specific. They're not saying you don't exist. They're saying you don't exist in this particular way. Okay. And it's actually a middle way between two larger positions. So one would be affirmation of an eternal self, right? That you have an eternal, stable soul, an Atman, if you will. And that gives you an absolute permanent identity. I am always going to be, there's something about me, something distinctive about me, Laura Walsh, that is always going to be me and is always going to exist in samsara or out of samsara, wherever that is. Okay. On the other hand, you could have people, and it builds continuity between this life and the next life or lives. All right. On the other hand, you can have folks who say, actually, like, this is it, right? When I die, like, there's no connection between the Laura Walsh who exists now and what exists after I die. Like, I'm just done. There's no connection, all right? And anything good I do in this life, that's great. Maybe, it could have positive ripple effects, I guess, but there's no reward for me in the next life for what I've done. There's also no punishment for me, right, for what I've done, from this point of view. I generate karma, but it never comes back to me, right? Once I'm dead, I've escaped the consequences. Other people might live with the consequences, but not me, all right? So no self, on the one hand, it does deny the eternal self or soul, right? But unlike that absolute disjunction between this life and the next, it does recognize some form of continuity as well as karmic consequences between individual life moments and from one life to the next. All right, so there's some kind of continuity. Now, this is a challenging concept, right? So I'm not claiming to fully understand it, but I came up all on my own with some analogies that help me understand it better. So I've been playing Wordle. I don't know if anyone else is, but it's put me in mind of word games, and I don't know if anyone else did this game where you get like a 4-letter word and you have to turn it into another word. But to get there, you have to fill in, you can change one letter at a time, but it has to be a word. I loved these games when I was younger. So lake would become cake, cake would become Coke, coma, cola, cold, told, toad, road. Okay, so for me, there's continuity. This could represent either me when I'm 5, 10, 15, whatever it is, right? There's continuity, but I'm not exactly the same, right? Or it could represent lifetime to lifetime, right? Whatever I am is connected to what I was when I was coma or Coke, but not in a way that's sort of definitively me, all right? So that would be no self, right? The relationship of lake and road, okay? There's one letter that's the same, but it's in a different place, okay? Another analogy, I don't know, is if anyone's seen James Bond. These are all pictures of actors who've played James Bond as James Bond, right? But James Bond is a fictional character, right? So from a Buddhist perspective, you might say Laura Walsh is a fiction that kind of holds together my experiences, my physical body, or whatever. It makes something look coherent and continuous or contiguous that isn't really, right? It doesn't really exist. My last analogy would be to a bowl of trail mix, okay? So the bowl would be Laura Walsh, myself, and I contain a bunch of different things that just by coincidence, by the fact of where I was born, historical events that have kind of collided in the form of Laura Walsh, right? I think I mentioned 2 weeks ago, basically if World War I hadn't happened, I wouldn't be me because I had two ancestors who met in a conscientious objectors camp, right? So it's sort of like World War I collides with immigration patterns to the United States, combines with job opportunities in San Diego, California, land-grant universities in Indiana, and all of that has just smushed together into me, right? And eventually I'm going to die, and all these different parts, right, are going to kind of go off on their own. They're not going to be held together by Laura Walsh anymore, all right? So the components of the trail mix represent what Buddhists call the 5 skandhas: conditioning factors, feelings, perception, matter, consciousness. These all smush together in what appears to be a self. I have a couple other, phrases that were helpful to me in understanding this concept of no self, that a person is a series of clusters of events, physical and mental, that kind of occur in a human pattern. In this case, that would be me. A person, right, is a mass of constantly changing, causally connected, not casually, but causally connected physical and mental phenomena. My sense of self is a label, like I'm very attached to this notion of me. I like me, being myself. But it's just a label that I'm imposing on all these other processes and phenomena. I'm a complex flow of physical and mental phenomena. So like a flow has continuity, right? But you're not like a substance, according to this teaching. All right. But if I were to boil down all that complicated stuff, the no self, right, is not an eternally stable soul, but it's something that's interdependent, and it's something that's ever-changing. All right, so what does all this say to me as an Episcopal Christian? All right, so the challenge for me is to think about how am I related to my older self, right? And in what form do I exist after my death, right? And I have a lot that I could say about this, but I just chose a Bible verse to represent kind of my thinking about this. So the verse is this: "Beloved, we are God's children now. What we will be has not yet been revealed. What we do know is this: when he is revealed, we will be like him, for we will see him as he is." Now, when I read this verse in light of the teaching of no self, I think, well, I know that I'm God's child now, right? And what I'm going to be, I'm not sure of. But when it says what we do know is we'll be like him, I take this verse as kind of trying to disrupt a sense of attachment to myself as I am in order to become more like Christ now and when I die. All right, so I'm still working through this and thinking through it, but I do have this sense that whatever biblical teachings there are about the resurrection of the body, about the life to come, they should, instead of entrenching my attachment to self, meaning like, oh, I'm going to be a Christian so that I can be exactly like I am now, except maybe better, like so that I can exist as me in the next life. I might be missing something, but when I explore those teachings as disruptive of my attachment to a specific notion of self, I don't know, I get something more out of it. All right, so another teaching, and these are quicker, is the teaching of skillful means, or upaya. So skillful means a teaching that may not be literally true, but is adapted to the needs and capacities of different people. All right, so there's an illustration of this from a Buddhist text called the Lotus Sutra. And it's a story of the burning house and the 3 carts, and it works great for me because I have 3 kids, so I can adapt it to mine. But the story goes, there's a man who has 3 children, his house is on fire, he wants to get them out of the house quickly. So he tells one, oh, run out of the house, I have a sheep cart for you, or a ram cart for you. And then he tells the next, run out of the house, I have a deer cart for you, a cart pulled by a deer. And he tells the other, I have an ox cart ready for you. So that kid gets out of the house. And they all get out of the house, and instead, there's an even fancier cart that's not a ram cart, not a deer cart, not an ox cart. It's something even better. But they wouldn't have been able to have understood that greater thing because they're children. So the analogy for me is if I were trying to get my children out of the house quickly, I'd tell my 4-year-old, I have a brand new tricycle for you, right? She'd run out of the house. I'd tell my 7-year-old, I have a bike with no training wheels for you, and that has streamers on it or something. She'd run out of the house. And I tell my son, I have a gear bike for you, like a bike with gears, so you can do your mountain biking now. And he'd run out of the house. And then they get out of the house, and all there would be is a brand new minivan, right? So the point is, I told them what I needed to tell them to get them out of the house, right? But what I have for them is something even better. So that's where the Mahayana, the greater vehicle, gets its name, right? So the Buddha had to tell people, self-effort, arhat, ideal, because that's all they were ready for, right? But the greater vehicle was waiting for them. All right. So related to this is the teaching of two truths, right? That there are convenient truths in life, including in religion for Buddhists, which is maybe a useful description, or it might be helpful for realizing ultimate truth. But then there's the ultimate truth, which is revealed at a later developmental or historical stage, okay, in the case of Buddhists. So they'd say we had these earlier teachings that were helpful, but it's only later that we realize actually compassion is the greater ideal, or whatever it is. So for me, has anyone seen this billboard like between here and Little Rock? I haven't driven to Little Rock in a long time, but this billboard is around the world, right? Where are you going, heaven or hell? And I sometimes, anyway, I'm opening up the possibility. So this is, a very simplistic understanding of Christianity, right? Are you going to heaven? Are you going to hell? Figure out how to go to heaven, and then, we're done. Okay, call this phone number, it's over. All right. So to me, the challenge is, I wonder, this is challenging for me, are there some doctrinal truths, right, that are actually just skillful means? All right, and if so, which ones? All right. So for me, I think in particular, the hellfire thing. That's the one that I'll go and say, I can see why it would be helpful, right? To metaphorically, I guess, light a fire under someone. You know what I mean? If that's what you need to get, I don't preach hellfire, by the way, so I'm not saying I'm going to use this particular skillful means, but it helps me understand the limitations of this doctrine, but also to reconsider its usefulness, right, for me as an Episcopalian Christian. I love the image of every day moment of my life or with my life, I can choose to feed the fire or cut off the fuel supply, right? With what I do, what I think, and what I feel. And so the image of escaping the fire or extinguishing the fire, I actually find very helpful and applicable to my life as an Episcopalian Christian. Not so much the let's make sure you don't go to hell part of it, but the fire image. So that's one thing that's illuminating. My last example is a Buddhist teaching about freedom from views. All right. So this comes from a sermon that the Buddha allegedly gave. So a monk came to the Buddha and said, I'm going to stop being Buddhist and following you unless you answer all my questions about the cosmos, about the nature of the self, about the afterlife. I need to know this stuff, or I go no further with this whole Buddha disciple thing. And he gives what's called the arrow sermon. So the Buddha says, imagine someone was struck by a poisonous arrow. Would he sit there and say, I wonder who shot this thing? What kind of bowstring, gave it its velocity? What feathers were used? What type of bird or whatever? And so the Buddha said, don't die of curiosity, right? Pull out the arrow of suffering, right? So your interest in these views might actually be impeding your escape, your achievement of nirvana, right? Your release from suffering, your release from the cycle of rebirth and redeath. So other Buddhist traditions often have some form of this. Doctrine might actually be an obstacle to your awakening, right? I have found in my experience of Christian tradition, doctrine, we got to get the doctrine right, otherwise, you're not. This other stuff isn't going to work out, But what if we relax that a little bit? And I'll give you a couple examples so we can cycle back to Theravada versus Mahayana Buddhism. This is an example of a view. Enlightenment, nirvana can be really reached only through one's own efforts, right? Theravada Buddhists might say, yes, only your own. Mahayana would say, no, bodhisattvas can help. To me, this looks like a lot like the faith versus works debate in Christianity, right? And then we have this one. The ultimate goal of life is to reach enlightenment, nirvana, right? Theravada Buddhists might say, yes, like we've got to reach nirvana. Mahayana Buddhists would say, no, it's better to become a compassionate bodhisattva. To me, this looks an awful lot like what some people call the conflict between evangelical Christians and social justice Christians, right? Is the point to just get out of this world, like go to heaven as quickly as possible? No, anyway. Or is it to invest in this world and relieve suffering? All right. So I want to propose that maybe attachment to any view about ultimate reality is an obstacle to nirvana, right? So anytime we find ourselves holding a view too firmly, maybe, ironically, right, that it's getting in our way, right? That the thing is, should I find out if it's faith or works? Should I find out if it's heaven or the kingdom of reign of God on earth? It's like anytime I feel myself overcommitting to one of those things, think maybe this is getting in the way, I could say, of my salvation or of the salvation of the world, right? So I was reminded of this story. I went on this 10-day meditation retreat in Nepal. Most people were not Westerners like me, but some of us were, in this tradition of meditation. And Goenka, we had video messages from this guy, Goenkaji, and he tells the story about, toward the end of the retreat, about someone who gets served a bowl of milk rice with a cardamom seed in it. It's a black, if you've ever seen cardamom out of the pods, it's these black seeds. And they say, I don't want to eat that. It looks like there's a little rock in here. And he says, well, just take it out. It's still good. You know what I mean? Like, keep on eating. So the idea here being, if there's some doctrine really troubling you, just set it aside, right? Like it still works. It still tastes just as good. So for me, freedom from views in Episcopal Christianity, the challenge is to say, does attachment to views obstruct our salvation, right? Is it an obstacle? But the illumination part is maybe to ask more often, not, is this true, but does it work? Is it practical for the purposes of salvation, liberation, and the relief of suffering? All right. So that was Buddhism, and we'll do Sikhism next week, and that'll be the last of our first cluster. So thanks all, and I'll stick around. I did the 8:45, so I'm not going to do the 11th. So if you want to catch me, I'd be happy to stay and chat for a few minutes.